Ever felt the chill of the unknown while working the night shift? Join us as we dive into 5 terrifying true stories that will make you think twice about your late-night shifts. Don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling tales that haunt the darkness. Nurse Emily Carter had worked at St. James Hospital for nearly a decade. The night shift had become her second home, a quiet sanctuary from the chaos of the day. But on the night of November 15, 2016, the peace she cherished turned into a nightmare. It was around 2 a.m. when Emily first noticed something strange. Walking down the long, dimly lit hallway of the hospital's older wing, she heard a faint, shuffling sound behind her. She stopped and turned, but there was nothing, just the flickering lights and the distant hum of hospital machines. She shrugged it off as nerves or perhaps the janitor finishing up his rounds. The shift had been uneventful so far. A few patients came in with minor injuries, but the emergency room was unusually slow. Emily was used to the eerie stillness of the night, but something about that particular night felt different. There was an unnerving tension in the air. Around 3 a.m., Emily was at the nurse's station reviewing patient charts when she saw a shadow move out of the corner of her eye. It wasn't the usual blur of motion from a coworker. This shadow was long, tall, and seemed to glide across the floor. She snapped her head toward the direction, but again, nothing. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that, according to the staff schedule, she was the only nurse on duty in this section of the hospital. Just then, the phone at her desk rang. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she reached for it. On the other end was a frazzled voice, an elderly patient from room 202. "Nurse, there's someone in my room," the woman whispered, clearly terrified. Emily rushed down the hallway, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor as she reached the door of room 202. She paused outside, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she opened the door. The patient, Mrs. Louise Harper, was sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "He was here? A man? Standing in the corner," she stammered, pointing to the far side of the room. Emily's blood ran cold as she looked toward the corner. There was no one there. She checked the room thoroughly, assuring Mrs. Harper that no one had been in her room. But the elderly woman insisted. "He was watching me, just standing there." Trying to calm the patient down, Emily made a note in her chart, chalking it up to a nightmare or confusion. But as she left the room and walked back into the hallway, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. Hours passed, and the hospital remained quiet. Emily tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered. She checked the security cameras at 4 a.m., hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. As she rewound the footage from earlier in the night, her breath caught in her throat. There on the screen in the hallway outside room 202 was a man. Tall, gaunt, dressed in dark clothing, he stood perfectly still, watching Emily as she passed by on her rounds. He had been there all along, standing just outside of her line of sight. When she had turned to look, he had simply stepped back into the shadows. But that wasn't the most chilling part. When Emily rewound the footage even further, she discovered that the man had been following her since she started her shift at midnight, always lurking just out of sight. Panicking, Emily called hospital security, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No man, no sign of forced entry, nothing. The cameras showed the figure, but there was no record of anyone entering or leaving the hospital at that time. Emily couldn't shake the image of the man watching her. For the rest of her shift, every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder, until finally, morning came and she could leave. The incident was never explained. Some believe the man was a lost patient or a vagrant who had slipped in unnoticed. Others whispered about the ghost stories surrounding the hospital's old wing, where countless patients had passed away over the decades. Emily never worked the night shift again. Jerry Matthews had worked the night shift at Lincoln's gas station for about 6 months when the strange incident occurred. Located just off Interstate 90 in a remote part of Idaho, the station was one of the few places open after midnight in that area. Most nights, Jerry would get a few truckers stopping in for fuel or snacks, but it was usually quiet, a perfect job for someone who enjoyed solitude. On the night of July 8, 2019, Jerry clocked in at 11 p.m. The weather had been dry all week, not a single drop of rain in sight, and the forecast showed nothing unusual. By 11:45 p.m., the station was empty, except for Jerry, who was behind the counter flipping through a magazine. Out of nowhere, the automatic door opened, making Jerry look up. A man entered, but something about him was off. He was soaking wet, his clothes clung to his skin, his hair dripping water onto the floor. The first thought that crossed Jerry's mind was, where did he come from? There hadn't been a car outside for nearly an hour, and the sky was clear, no sign of rain for miles. The man didn't speak. He walked straight to the refrigerated section, his soggy shoes squeaking on the tile. Jerry watched him, uneasy. "Hey man," Jerry called out, "you okay?" No response. The man pulled out a bottle of water, odd considering how drenched he already was, and came up to the counter. Jerry rang him up, trying to make conversation. "You get caught in a river or something?" The man stared blankly at Jerry, his eyes wide and glassy, as if he hadn't heard a word. He handed over a crumpled $5 bill, and Jerry quickly gave him his change, just wanting the interaction to be over. As the man turned to leave, Jerry couldn't help but notice something else. There were no footprints. The wet man had been walking around the gas station, yet not a single drop of water had marked the floor behind him. Jerry felt a chill crawl up his spine, but before he could say anything, the man walked out into the night. Jerry rushed to the door, watching as the man disappeared down the dark highway, on foot. No car, no bike, nothing. The whole encounter was strange, but it was what Jerry found after that shook him to his core. About an hour later, Jerry's shift was nearing its end, and he decided to check the security footage to review the strange man. He rewound the tape to the time the man had walked in. Only, there was nothing. The automatic door had opened, but no one appeared on the camera. It was as if Jerry had spoken to thin air. Panic set in. Jerry tried to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned. Maybe it was some kind of trick of the light. But deep down, he knew what he had witnessed was real. He had seen the wet man, had spoken to him, taken his money, but the evidence was gone. Shaken, Jerry spent the rest of the night anxiously waiting for his shift to end. The next morning, he recounted the story to his manager, who dismissed it as stress or fatigue. But Jerry knew better. After doing some research, Jerry discovered a local legend about a man who had drowned in the nearby Snake River a decade earlier. He had been driving late at night when his car skidded off the road and plunged into the river. The man's body had been found days later, soaked and bloated from the water. Ever since then, there had been sporadic reports of a man, soaking wet, appearing at gas stations and diners along Interstate 90. But each time, just like with Jerry, the man would vanish without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of his visit. Jerry quit his night shift job 2 weeks later, unable to shake the eerie feeling that the man from the river might return. Sarah Lawson had been a nurse at the Pinewood Mental Health Facility for over 3 years. Nestled deep in the woods of Pennsylvania, the facility had a reputation for being one of the best in the state. However, the night shift was always filled with a peculiar tension. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own, and the silence was often deafening. On the night of October 1st, 2018, Sarah started her shift at 11 p.m., a mix of excitement and unease swirling in her stomach. The clock struck 3:30 a.m. when the first call came in. The phone at the nurse's station rang, cutting through the stillness like a knife. Sarah picked it up, expecting to hear one of the residents asking for help. "Hello?" she said, her voice echoing in the empty room. There was silence on the other end, a chilling quiet that made Sarah's skin crawl. Just as she was about to hang up, a voice emerged. Soft, barely above a whisper. "Help me." Sarah's heart raced. "Who is this?" she asked, but there was no response, just the sound of heavy breathing. Frustrated and unnerved, she hung up, trying to convince herself it was just a prank call. Moments later, the phone rang again. This time, she answered it more cautiously. "Hello? Help me. I can't breathe." The voice sounded desperate, filled with panic. "Where are you?" Sarah pressed, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this a patient trying to escape, or someone else entirely? "I'm in the dark. I can't see." The voice trembled, sending shivers down Sarah's spine. "Is this a joke?" She shouted into the receiver, her nerves fraying, but the line went dead again. With a feeling of dread hanging over her, Sarah decided to check on the patients. She made her rounds, but everyone appeared to be sleeping peacefully in their rooms. Each time she passed by room 204, the hair on her arms stood up. It was one of the facility's most troubled patients, a young man named Mark, who had a history of violent outbursts. He had been admitted after a series of psychotic breaks, and Sarah always kept a close eye on him during her shifts. As she neared his room, the phone rang once more. She rushed back to the nurse's station, answering it breathlessly. "Hello? I see you." The voice was now chillingly clear, sending a wave of panic through Sarah. "You should check on Mark." Sarah froze. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the caller hung up. Fearing the worst, she dashed to Mark's room. The door was ajar, and as she pushed it open, her heart sank. The room was empty. Panic surged as she ran to the common area, desperately searching for him. "Mark," she called, but her voice echoed through the empty halls. Then she heard it, a soft thud coming from the basement. Against her better judgment, Sarah followed the sound down the dimly lit staircase. The air grew colder as she descended, and the light flickered ominously above her head. At the bottom, she saw a shadowy figure standing by a closed door. "Mark!" she shouted, fear gripping her heart. "Is that you?" The figure turned slowly, revealing a familiar face, Mark. But he looked different, as if he were in a trance. His eyes were vacant, and his expression was unsettlingly calm. He stood perfectly still, staring into the darkness. "What are you doing down here?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling. "I'm waiting for someone," he replied flatly. "Waiting for who?" Sarah pressed, her instincts screaming at her to get him back upstairs. "Help me," Mark echoed, but it sounded hollow, as if someone else had taken control of his voice. Suddenly, the phone rang again, shattering the tension. Sarah whipped around, her heart racing. She had left the phone on the counter in the common area, and it was now ringing frantically. "Stay here," she ordered Mark as she rushed back upstairs. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking. "Help me, in the dark." The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Who are you?" Sarah shouted into the receiver, desperate for answers. The voice whispered back, "I'm your next patient. Help me before it's too late." And then the line went dead. With the feeling of dread solidifying in her stomach, Sarah bolted back down the stairs. But when she reached the basement, Mark was gone. Panic surged through her as she frantically searched the dark corners of the room. Then she heard it, the sound of laughter echoing from the shadows. "You should have listened," a distorted voice called out. Terrified, Sarah ran back upstairs, her heart racing. She reached the nurse's station, but the phone was silent now. She called for the police, her voice shaky as she explained the situation. When the officers arrived, they searched the facility thoroughly but found no trace of Mark or any evidence of a disturbance. Sarah, shaken and exhausted, could only sit back and wonder who or what had been on the other end of that phone call. Days turned into weeks, and Mark never returned to the facility. He vanished without a trace, and the haunting phone calls continued to plague Sarah every night, each one sounding more frantic and desperate than the last. The whispers echoed in her mind, leaving her questioning the reality of the world around her. She eventually quit her job, unable to cope with the fear and uncertainty. The Pinewood Mental Health Facility remains open, but Sarah Lawson's chilling experience serves as a reminder that some patients carry their darkness with them, long after they leave. Lisa Rodriguez had been a night shift nurse at St. Mary's Hospital for over 2 years. Known for its excellent care and dedication, the hospital had a reputation for being a safe haven for those in need. But for Lisa, working the night shift often meant dealing with the eerie stillness of the halls, broken only by the occasional beeping of machines or the distant sound of an echoing footstep. On January 15, 2021, Lisa started her shift at 11 p.m., feeling confident and prepared for a long night ahead. The first few hours were typical. She checked on her patients, administered medication, and updated charts. But as the clock ticked toward 12:30 a.m., she began to feel a strange unease settle in. During a routine check, Lisa decided to take a break at the nurse's station, which overlooked the main hallway. As she sat down to sip her coffee, she glanced at the security monitors, something she often did to keep an eye on the patients in the common areas. But something caught her eye, a flicker on the screen. Lisa leaned closer. There, in the corner of the hallway, was a shadowy figure standing motionless. It was unusually tall and seemed to be peering directly into the camera, almost as if it was watching her. "Who is that?" Lisa whispered to herself, puzzled. She quickly looked away from the monitor to the hallway, but it was empty. The feeling of dread wrapped around her like a cold blanket. Taking a deep breath, she returned her gaze to the screen, only to find the figure had disappeared. Shrugging it off as a trick of the light, Lisa continued her shift. But the unease lingered. Over the next hour, she found herself checking the cameras more frequently, hoping to reassure herself that everything was fine. Each time, she felt a growing sense of foreboding. At 1:45 a.m., the figure appeared again. This time, it was closer, almost at the end of the hallway. Lisa's heart raced as she watched it. The figure was obscured by shadows, making it hard to discern any details. Panic set in as Lisa frantically switched to another camera angle, but the figure was no longer visible. She decided it was time to investigate. Taking a flashlight, she cautiously stepped out of the nurse's station and into the dimly lit hallway. Each step echoed ominously against the tile floor, and the oppressive silence made her skin crawl. Lisa made her way down the corridor, shining her flashlight in the direction where she had seen the figure. As she approached the end of the hall, she noticed that the door to room 314 was slightly ajar. It was a room that had been empty for months, awaiting renovation. "Hello?" Lisa called out, her voice trembling. She pushed the door open, and the beam of her flashlight illuminated the space. It was dark and still, with dust motes swirling in the air. The room felt cold, and an unsettling chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Lisa jumped, spinning around to face the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as she pulled and pushed against it, but it was stuck fast. Then she heard it, a soft whisper coming from the darkness inside the room. "Help me." "Who's there?" Lisa shouted, her voice rising with fear. She fumbled for her phone to call for help, but just as she found it, the whispering stopped. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the door, but her pleas echoed back at her, unanswered. After what felt like an eternity, the door suddenly flew open. Lisa stumbled forward, gasping for breath. The hallway was empty, but the oppressive silence now felt heavier. She bolted back to the nurse's station, shaking uncontrollably. Once there, she checked the cameras again, desperate for any sign of what had happened. But the feed was static. Nothing but a blank screen. Lisa felt as if she were losing her grip on reality. The bizarre events of the night were too much to comprehend. By 3 a.m., Lisa was exhausted, but the adrenaline kept her alert. The phone rang, breaking the tense atmosphere. Lisa picked it up, but the line was silent. Then she heard the whisper again. "Help me, room 314. Her blood ran cold. This time, she knew it wasn't just a figment of her imagination. Something dark lingered in the hospital, and she was being drawn deeper into its mystery. Determined to uncover the truth, Lisa gathered her courage and returned to room 314. As she approached, the door creaked open on its own. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, and she stepped inside. The room was the same as before, but now a faint glow emitted from the corner. Lisa shone her flashlight in that direction and gasped. There, lying on the floor, was a hospital gown, old, tattered, and stained. It was impossible, but somehow it felt familiar. The whisper returned, more insistent now. "Help me." Lisa knelt down, examining the gown. As she reached for it, the temperature in the room plummeted, and she felt a breath of icy air wash over her. The whisper turned into a wail, echoing in her ears. "Help me! I can't leave." In that moment, Lisa understood. The figure she had seen was a lost soul, trapped in the hospital, begging for release. She felt a surge of empathy, mixed with fear. "I'll help you," she vowed, her voice shaking. Suddenly, the room shook, as if a strong wind had blown through. The whispers turned into screams, the air crackling with energy. Lisa stumbled back, fear consuming her, as she dashed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. For the rest of her shift, Lisa could barely focus. She relayed her experiences to her supervisor, but he dismissed her concerns as mere fatigue from the long hours. Despite his skepticism, Lisa knew what she had encountered was real. After that night, the incidents continued. Patients reported seeing shadows in their rooms, and nurses experienced strange occurrences late at night. Lisa eventually left her job, unable to bear the weight of the haunting anymore. To this day, St. Mary's Hospital has gained notoriety among staff and patients alike for being haunted. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the whispers of the lost soul calling out for help in the dark corridors. Tom Miller had been a caregiver at Silver Oaks Nursing Home for nearly 5 years. He loved his job, caring for the elderly and listening to their stories. Each resident had a unique tale to share, filled with memories of love, loss, and laughter. But working the night shift could often feel lonely, especially in a place where shadows seemed to stretch and twist under the dim lights. On the night of February 2nd, 2019, Tom began his shift at 10 p.m. The first few hours passed uneventfully, with Tom performing his usual duties, checking on residents, dispensing medications, and ensuring everyone was comfortable. As the clock approached 2 a.m., the nursing home fell into a deep silence, broken only by the faint hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the building settling. While doing his rounds, Tom stopped outside room 203, where Mrs. Johnson, a sweet elderly lady, had been residing for several months. He noticed the door was slightly ajar and heard her mumbling. Concerned, he knocked gently. "Mrs. Johnson? Are you all right?" The mumbling stopped and silence filled the air. Frowning, Tom pushed the door open. "Mrs. Johnson?" To his surprise, the room was empty. The bed was made and the curtains were drawn. Puzzled, he checked the bathroom, but she wasn't there either. Tom quickly glanced at the logbook on the desk, which noted that Mrs. Stad Johnson had been resting since 10:30 p.m. Confused, he jotted down a note about her absence before continuing his rounds. As Tom moved toward the common area, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The nursing home had a history. It was built in the late 1960s and had seen its share of residents pass away within its walls. Rumors circulated among the staff about ghostly apparitions and strange noises at night. Most dismissed these tales as folklore, but Tom had experienced a few odd occurrences himself over the years. That night, as he made his way back to the nurse's station, he heard a soft whisper echoing through the hall. He paused, straining to hear. "Help me, please." The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the stillness. "Hello?" Tom called out, his voice shaky, but there was no answer. Thinking it might be one of the residents, he followed the sound toward the end of the hall. The whispers grew louder, guiding him to room 205. He opened the door and found it empty as well. The bed was neatly made, and the resident, Mr. Thompson, was not there. "Where is everyone?" he muttered, a sense of dread creeping over him. Just as he was about to step back into the hallway, he heard the whisper again, now sounding desperate. "Tom, help me." His heart raced as he instinctively turned to the wall beside him. "Who's there?" he asked, feeling foolish for talking to a wall. The response was immediate. 3 soft knocks echoed back. Tom's stomach dropped. He took a step back, nearly colliding with the bedside table. "Is anyone in there?" he called, but silence followed. He quickly left the room and returned to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the fear that threatened to consume him. Sitting down, Tom wrote down the names of the missing residents in the logbook. Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Thompson were just the beginning. By the end of his shift, he realized several other residents were unaccounted for, including Mr. Wilson and Mrs. Rodriguez, both of whom he had seen earlier in the evening. At 3:30 a.m., Tom was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion when he heard the whispering again. Clearer this time. "Tom, help us." He bolted upright, gripping the edge of the desk. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It felt urgent, pleading. Unable to ignore it, Tom took a deep breath and headed back down the hall. The sound led him to room 201, a resident who had passed away just a month earlier. He hesitated, uncertainty gnawing at him, but the voices were insistent. Pushing open the door, Tom was met with darkness. The curtains were drawn tight, and the shadows danced eerily across the walls. He flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. "This is ridiculous," he murmured, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. Suddenly, the whispers rose to a crescendo. "Help us. We can't leave." The sound filled the room, drowning out his thoughts. Panicking, Tom stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bed. Just then, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A flicker of movement near the closet. He turned his flashlight toward it, and the beam revealed a figure standing in the shadows. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with fear. "Please help us," she cried, her voice a mixture of desperation and sorrow. "Who are you?" Tom asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm Margaret. I died here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need your help to move on. They're keeping us here." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard of spirits lingering in places where they had suffered, but this was his first encounter. "How can I help you?" he stammered, trying to steady his breathing. "Break the cycle," she replied, her voice growing fainter. "Free us from this place." Before he could respond, the light flickered back on, illuminating the room. But Margaret had vanished, leaving Tom alone in the suffocating silence. Desperate for answers, Tom rushed back to the nurse's station and called the on-duty supervisor. He explained everything: the whispers, the missing residents, and the woman in the room. The supervisor listened, but was dismissive, attributing it to Tom's fatigue. "Just finish your shift, and we'll look into it tomorrow," he said, clearly unconvinced. Feeling isolated, Tom decided to investigate further. He rummaged through old files, searching for information about the nursing home's history. What he found chilled him to the bone. Silver Oaks had been built on the grounds of a former asylum that had been shut down for neglect and abuse. Many patients had died in the facility, their suffering forgotten as the nursing home took its place. Each name Tom read felt like a ghostly echo of the lives lost. Fueled by a mix of fear and determination, Tom returned to the hallways. He decided to confront the whispers. "If you need help, I'm here," he shouted, hoping to draw out the spirits. The building was silent, but then he heard it. The soft rustle of fabric, the faintest sound of shuffling footsteps. "Help us," the voices called again, this time echoing from room 207. Tom's heart raced as he approached the door, pushing it open with trembling hands. The room was dark, and the air felt heavy. As he stepped inside, he saw the figures, several elderly residents, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. "What happened to you?" he gasped, stepping back in shock. "We're trapped," one woman whispered, her voice breaking. "They don't remember us. We can't move on." In that moment, Tom understood. These were the souls of the residents who had passed away, trapped in a limbo, bound to the nursing home that had failed them. "What do I need to do?" he asked, feeling a sense of urgency wash over him. "Tell our stories," they all murmured in unison. "Remember us." Realizing that he needed to acknowledge their pain, Tom agreed. "I promise," he said firmly. "I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here." With that vow, the air in the room shifted, and he felt a wave of warmth wash over him. The residents' faces began to fade, their expressions softening as peace settled over them. As dawn broke, the first light of morning spilled through the windows. Tom felt a sense of relief mixed with sorrow. The whispers had ceased, and the oppressive heaviness lifted from the nursing home. He completed his shift, determined to share the stories of the residents who had been forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Tom began documenting the history of Silver Oaks Nursing Home, interviewing staff and families to ensure the memories of those who had passed lived on. He shared their stories with anyone who would listen, bringing light to the shadows of the past. As for the nursing home, it has since been transformed into a place of remembrance. Tom's efforts led to a community memorial honoring the residents who had lost their lives there. And while the whispers no longer haunt the halls, Tom knows that their spirits are finally at peace. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through the shadows of the night. Each story reveals the haunting truth of what can linger in the dark when no one is watching. Remember, the night shift isn't just about clocking hours. It's a window into the unknown, where every creak and whisper could tell a story of its own. If you've experienced something eerie during your own night shifts, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Night Post for more terrifying tales that will keep you up at night. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on. You never know what might be lurking just out of sight.